Hello, Life Point Church, and welcome back to the woods for this week's lesson of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we're on lesson 2.2, God of the Faithful. I hope you are just coming off a great weekend that you spent with your family, and I hope you had a great holiday weekend and everything is just fine. So why don't you join me this week, and we're going to learn what it means to be faithful, and how God is faithful to us is really the story that we're going to take from this. So this week we're going to talk about Abram. We're going to talk about his family and his wife and how he was able to walk in faith. And it's so comforting to know that even a great patriarch, of a good faithful man like Abram, we could see that, well, sometimes he also made mistakes. So what did God do with those mistakes? And it's so comforting to know that God is always faithful. We find Abram, he was living with his father still, around his family, just like many of us do. And he was living in a time where people weren't following God. They were following false idols. They were doing the wrong thing. But God called out to Abram, and he said that he wanted him to leave his family. He wanted him to leave his country. He wanted him to leave everything that he had. He wanted to leave that all behind, and he wanted to lead Abram in a place where he wanted him. God was calling Abram, and if you think about that in your life, and you think about it how in our journey, aren't you thankful for a God that calls you out? So Abram, he had to make a decision, and he had to leave his family. He had to leave everything behind. His brother had died, and he still had his nephew to think about. He had his family to think about. So when Abram received this calling, he did something that was very reasonable. And I think he did something that most of us would do. He took his family with him. His father went with him in his travels, and we know that so did Lot, his brother's son, his nephew. And we say, well, that's pretty reasonable. But the thing is, it's not what God asked him to do. God asked him to leave everything behind. So we could see that in the beginning of Abram's calling, he struggled with leaving his past behind. And I think when we think about that in our own lives, we could see the similarities, can't we? God is calling us to something great, and sometimes he calls us out of our comfort zone. He calls us to do something that we think that we can't do, and we can't really leave everything behind, it seems sometimes. So as we continue today, let's just kind of dwell on that. About leaving our past behind. Now through this week we're going to learn how those decisions hindered Abram, and we're going to learn what God did with those decisions also, because Abram really wasn't following God's plan quite yet. So let's see throughout this week what God does with that. Thank you. Please remember to join me tomorrow for lesson 2.